on Tuesday night, there was, an event under the theme, Has the Fourth Republic Delivered? And in a paper presented by Yaw Nsarkoh, titled Towards a Mindset Revolution, Ghana Beyond New Liberal Capitalism, was the Fourth Republic a miracle that led nowhere? He talked about lots of things, including changing our appreciation of what constitutes development. This morning, we are privileged to be joined by Yaw Nsarkoh, who prefers to be known as a citizen who presented that paper. Yaw, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me too.
Great. So let's get into the conversation and start off with your view on changing our appreciation of development. First, what's wrong with how we perceive development and what must change about our perception of development?
Well, the development discourse, and when I say this, I talk more about policymakers than about the people on the streets, because I think the people on the streets understand what development is and they know what they're looking for from it. But the development discourse in neoliberal democracies, especially in the duration of the Fourth Republic, has been over-financialized.
Okay.
So when we talk about development, it very quickly goes to GDP growth. How much did we get in Eurobonds? What is the deficit? And so these are all important indicators, but at the end of the day, they are not the outcomes that we are necessarily looking for. The outcomes that we are looking for in a democracy, in my view, are well summarized by the timeless and ageless ambitions of the French revolutionaries all those years back. We are looking for more liberty, more egalitarian opportunity, more fraternity. If you unload that properly, what development must, in the end, if it is to be vibrant and viable, deliver is a better life, dignity, more opportunity to all the citizens, not just a small group of people.
Okay. And this better life that you talk about being delivered to all the citizens, where do we start from?
Well, I'm by nature not someone who likes to dictate to people because I have a point of view, but I recognize that in this country there are also 32 million other people who have an equal point of view.
Sure.
So when you ask me where we should start the development discourse from, the first thing that I say is that we have to have a process of engagement where our policymakers and leaders are truly engaged with all sections of the society. They are very responsive, and they are able to take inputs and learning from all places in the society, distill it into an agenda, a strategy, a plan, whatever you want to call it, that it then enables people to be mobilized seriously, intensely, to deliver the agenda. So the starting point for me is always conversation. Democracy, in my view, is a conversation, and as soon as the conversation stops, decay sets in.
Okay. And talking about the conversation, I mean, in the past we've had some of these conversations. In the past we've talked about what we need to do as a country in order to grow. Now, you've talked about some of them in your paper, for instance, but you've had concerns about the implementation. So, for instance, we've talked about how, as an agrarian economy, we must go about agriculture. We've talked about irrigation. We've talked about value addition. And so we had all these plans about, planting for food and jobs. We had plans about one village, one dam. And we had plans about one district, one factory. What didn't we get right in all of these?
I wonder whether the design of our democracy instills sufficient accountability to the people. I mean, what happens when people make all these promises, which I call miracles that led nowhere, and they don't deliver on them? They still stand for elections, and they have a reasonable chance that they will be re-elected by us, the people. Now, if you have a democracy where people can thrive without delivery, then there's not much of an incentive for people to exert themselves in order to deliver what they want. At election time, they go around. That's why I call this a Santa Claus democracy. They go around, they pay some amounts of money to people here and there. In the paper that I presented, I said the CDD said to become president in Ghana requires $100 million. That is a huge amount of money if they are right in their estimate. So you build a subculture where Miracles that lead to nowhere become the order of the day. Promises are made, no intention of delivery. The people themselves, including you guys in the media, have contributed to a situation where we have a very short attention span. An issue comes up, it's talked about for 2 weeks. The next time something else has come up, and we abandon it and forget about it. So you do not have the stamina and sustained engagement of the people that is required to keep leaders accountable. And then on another level is the execution is a capability, is a skill, which we should be teaching in our schools as project management, etc. To be able to drive execution, you must also be willing to hold people accountable. And that does not always mean that you're taking popular actions. Accountability sometimes means you must take tough decisions and tough actions in order that whatever prosperity we are looking for as a people may be developed. So when you mix that cocktail, I think you then have an understanding of why we are where we are. We say many things, and then nothing happens, and we move on.
So what then must change when it comes to our democracy?
First is the over-monetization must stop. And over-monetization must stop. If I can ask you the question, tell me if I ask you the question, how much an American president spent on an election, you just need to go online and Google, and you will know from where Barack Obama, what you can find out. Now, you tell me, how much did Nana Akufo-Addo spend on the last election? How much did John Dramani Mahama spend? You can't answer.
No.
Where did the money come from? You can't answer. So we have collapsed into a situation where the Nobel laureate, Wole Soyinka, said, the so-called democracy we are practicing has collapsed into a public auction for the highest bidder. And if you have that situation, you go nowhere. So fundamentally, we need to sit down and have a conversation about how are we going to dismantle the environment of financial opacity. In the presentation, I mentioned that we had been ranked number 9 on the Financial Security Index. So the 9th West African country in terms of a lack of financial openness. This is a call for us to really sit up and say, what is going on? How can we have in a so-called democracy, how can we have a so-called regime of opacity of that degree coexisting? It means that the financial fund flows that are going into our political system, we are unable to track. It is heading then, as I said on the day, towards what became known in Latin America as a narco state. Soon, there is significant state capture. A few actors begin to control everything in the country because they are the people who have money. And if a few actors control it, they don't control it in order for the prosperity of the masses. They control it so that they themselves enrich themselves. And then you end up in a situation where, as you famously know, Josiah Mwangi Kariuki in Kenya said about the Jomo Kenyatta era, he said, we do not want a society which produces 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars. So that is the first thing that we need to do. When we have fixed that, we must then sit back and say, how do we ensure that there's a legal environment, the laws are shaped in order to make this possible, and then we have a system, a state, a competent state that can enforce these things without fear or favor. So that's where I would like to leave it.
Great, but I mean, while you want to leave it there, you've made a point. You've talked about what we need to do. But for many Ghanaians, particularly those within the lower classes, they've asked the question, why is nobody talking about these things? You've asked that, in your lecture, you talked about how we shouldn't fear because in your words, we can't be, but the reality is that today, nobody is talking. Where are the voices that you make reference to in the early 90s who were bold enough to take the system on?
The voices that we spoke about did their bit when it was necessary. Yes, we may take an intellectual and academic interest in why they are not speaking, but we must go back to Efremamu. Yangarai Assassini, he in that song, he says that it is now the turn of you and I.
Sure.
So rather than people asking where are the voices, I prefer that they ask themselves, what are they saying? What are they contributing? Why is everybody waiting for somebody to speak? And then people, I've got all sorts of calls and SMSs, and you need to do this again. And so I say, why don't you say that, okay, I too will join the conversation? That for me is the more relevant conversation. So every time you're tempted to ask, where are the voices, say, where is your voice? When those people were doing those things in those days, they were known as the young activists in the time. The Alliance for Change was full of people like Kweku Baku Jr., Kwesi Pratt Jr., Akoto Ampao, and so on. They were seen as the younger people on the scene. When I talk about sitting with Akufo-Addo, and so I was 24 at the time. So the idea that, and we were seen as the young people. Yes, I was younger than them, but we were seen as the young people. There were other people, BJ Darocha and so on and so forth on the scene at the time. But people stood up and they spoke. So I much prefer that the dialogue, the conversation shifts to when people are tempted to ask this question, they should ask themselves, why am I not speaking? And I'm not saying everybody in every hamlet must be talking about national policy directions and so on and so forth. But everybody in every hamlet must be saying, why don't I have basic sanitation? Why don't I have water? Why don't I have electricity? Who is the immediate point of contact of the state that I can exert accountability? And unless we are willing to do that, then the people of Ghana are not serious about development, period.
Great. This morning we're joined by Yaw Nsarkoh, who delivered that paper we've been talking about, when during the event on Tuesday night on whether the Fourth Republic has delivered. Let me say good morning and welcome to our listeners on Love 99.5 FM in Kumasi and on ATL FM in Cape Coast. So let me take you to what to do. And I see in there that you've talked about land reforms, and you tell us we know where you're going, but I don't know where you're going. So what is it that you want to do? I mean, you want us to do when it comes to our land. You've talked about everything that is different in other countries. What must Ghana do when it comes to its land ownership and the reforms?
Well, I posed the question in the presentation. Those who have watched it will see that I posed the question. And those who have read the paper, actually, which I encourage everybody to try and read because I think it's gone viral, so people should just get it and read it. I posed the question. I said that if anybody could mention to me a country that has gone forward to development and prosperity without the benefit of colonialism or the transatlantic slave trade, I'll be willing to hear. But I knew that nobody could answer that question because it does not exist in history. So what we are attempting is something that has never been done in history. And I need a reason to understand why something that has never been achieved in history will be achieved in Ghana alone. This was essentially the way that I framed it. What we must do is the question that you're asking. Well, it should be obvious to you. You go around the country, we have land guards. You know about land guards?
Sure.
It's a very euphemistic reference to the existence of private militias. We have lost control of this agenda to the extent that foreign missions have now had buildings broken down. There is even a question mark over whether the premises of a foreign mission is even the territory of the country that is hosting it. But let's leave that for the legal brains to debate and so on and so forth. And yet, our land mess sometimes gets even to that extent. You go to our court system, it is clogged with land cases. You go to, the president once talked about 50% of the national security budget is spent on the chieftaincy institution alone, 50%. And much of that has to do with land issues. What more do I need to say? So that is the state of affairs. I can give more and more and more examples, but we don't have forever this morning, so I don't want to go on. So we need to sit back and say, what is the basis of law that propels us to the stage of development that we want to get to? I have my views, but I am very careful about just sitting somewhere and dictating to people. So I said, get our thinkers. And I specifically said, when I say thinkers, I'm not talking only about people with formal education and so on and so forth. It comes to land, it comes to cultural matters. There are people, some of them, they've never stepped in a classroom before, but they have deep understanding of the socio-cultural context. Let us sit down and say what is the philosophy of land ownership that we want that will propel us to become a modern, developed state.
Okay.
And then we must find the leadership with the will. Land reforms is not an easy matter anywhere in the world. You need people who are tough, who are decisive, and who are willing to pursue the path of development, yea, though the heavens fall. Thank you.
Yes, and talking about, getting thinkers to start a conversation. Since you've raised it, let's start with you. What sort of new land ownership system do we need in Ghana?
We need to examine, for example, allodial lands as a basis, as saying that they are legal. You know what it means when you say allodial land? One of the bases for the determination of allodial land is the person who first arrived on the land. Now, you tell me, how do you determine that? Someone once said to me that his grandmother found, 5 acres of land or something, and she started to farm it, so it became hers. This can be the basis of law in 2023, but we don't want to upset the cart. So we agree when we say land is owned, extensive amounts of land are owned by some families. They came from their mother's womb with the land or what? How were they able to get it? And then you're told that, well, conquest is a basis of ownership in the law. Now, what are we saying? That I went somewhere and because I had the military or martial means in order to be able to defeat somebody, I took that person's land, and then the historical basis leaves it with me, and we are not willing to have a conversation. Then why did we battle colonialism? Why are we angry with the armed robbers then? We should also leave them. They go somewhere, they battle, they take your property, it becomes theirs in 40 years, 50 years, 60 years. So these are real issues. I understand the complexities. I know why, with an incompetent state and in a Robinson Crusoe society with a Santa Claus democracy, when you mention these issues, the politicians don't want to talk about them. Because all they are thinking about is, if I try to do this, then I'm going to lose votes. But if that's all that we are going to do, then as Christopher Okibo, he said in a different context, he was referring to poetry, when he said, art is not a contest for the popular vote. We must keep that at the back of our mind. Development is not a contest for the popular vote. If we want to develop, we have to take the difficult decisions that are necessary to get us there, and we must be willing to do what it takes. You talk about all the great leaders that have been able to deliver great structural transformation in their societies. They were tough people who could make tough decisions to move society forward in the long term. They were not thinking about the next election and the next cycle here and there and so on and so forth. They were thinking about the long-term health of society.
Great. So what difficult decisions do you propose when it comes to land ownership?
I've mentioned quite a few of them. Allodial lands as the basis of law, we need to change it.
Okay.
This sort of arbitrary emergence of anybody who says I'm a family head and therefore I own all these extensive amounts of land and so on and so forth, we need to look at it and say, how do we change the laws in order to make that? And these are not things that when we talk about them in Ghana, we think that they are pie in the sky. This was done under Mao Zedong in China. It was done under Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, General Park in South Korea. The Ho Chi Minh movement that emerged in Vietnam, they had to do this as well. So these are not things, Kagame, I've been talking about Southeast Asian countries and North Asian countries, but Paul Kagame has started a basis of reform in Rwanda. So when you mention these things in Ghana, they say, oh, but you're not realistic. So if we want to be realistic and mad in mediocrity, then, well, yes, let's stand still. But if you want to change society and you want structural improvements, then you have to make structural changes.
Great. Because of our time, let's get to the public sector. You've actually talked about Ghana's public sector. You've compared that to other parts of the world. You've talked about the people within the public sector in itself. You've talked about how in other countries people have hired the best brains. Tell me, what should change about Ghana's human resource within our public sector?
Well, that is a very big question. But the first thing that I would talk about when you talk about changing the talent base, which is what your question is that you have to look at your educational system. That is the first thing. From kindergarten to PhD. This was done when the internet emerged as a major driver of society. Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew went back to the educational system and changed it. And the reason was, according to Lee Kuan Yew, he said Singapore had been built on a model of hard work and conformity. But with the emergence of the internet, the world was no longer at steady state and could therefore not carry along on a model of conformity. So they had to inject into the educational curricula the importance of creativity. And they changed all the way to kindergarten. As we speak, the Chinese are talking about how to re-establish at the level of the global Olympics the Rubik's Cube. Why? Because they are disturbed that the preponderance of gadgets in society may take away from the analytical capabilities of children. This is how people who are serious about their society think about it. Now, we have to ask ourselves, in our educational system today, are we training people who can be world beaters in the future? If the answer is no, then let's sit down and let's have a conversation about what are the changes that we need to make. I spoke about some of them. I said, have we decolonized our syllabus enough? Do we even know and understand our own history? When you talk to many young people today and you say to them, do you know Efremamu was thrown out of the church? He was excommunicated because he wanted to wear cloth and he wanted to play African musical instruments. They look at you like you don't know. They don't know what you're talking about. I spoke about fairly recent history, just in the 90s. I've got so many reactions where people are saying to me, we didn't know all these things. So Akufo-Addo and Kwesi Pratt were once so close that Akufo-Addo launched his newspaper. So these are questions we must ask ourselves. Why only in 3 decades has the history disappeared? What are the changes that we need to make in order to make our collective attention span broaden and build a curiosity in us that we are willing to go back and understand the details and question? This is what Akosha Bami, Noel Tego, David Dosudote, and so on spoke about when they talked about the need for mindset revolution, the need for cultural reawakening, the need for the redefinition of who we are as citizens. What identity are we aspiring to?
Great. So, before we go, let's get to, I get to the question about Akufo-Addo, because in your letter to him, you've talked about wanting the Akufo-Addo that you knew. You've talked about what he must do within the last 18 months of his term. But, I think we've lost Yaw Nsarkoh. We'll try and get him back, because we need to also talk about sanitation. He's raised concerns about our flooding situation and how we don't seem to pay attention to even the things of sanitation. This is the Super Morning Show on Joy 99.7 FM. And this morning you've been listening to Yaw Nsarkoh, who delivered the paper on Tuesday night when an amalgam of professional bodies had a lecture on whether the Fourth Republic has delivered. And look, he's talked about a lot of things. You've heard him this morning make the point that even thinking our perceptions about development must change. Okay, it's not just about, yes, the macroeconomic figures matter, but that shouldn't be the end of all. Okay, so let me just get back onto the phone line. I was asking a question about sanitation. Okay, we've talked about everything. Yes, in the past, we've talked about how we wanted to be the cleanest city in Africa. That was supposed to be in the first term, extending into the second term, which ends on the 7th of January 2025. Why is it so difficult for us to have good sanitation?
I'm not quite sure I heard the question, but I will try and answer. And if I don't answer it, please tell me which side I left out, because your voice faded a bit.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, at the end of the day, what I want, what I think, what I believe is irrelevant to the matter. The point is, how does Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo want to be remembered in history as a president? That is what he must address and tackle. And that's why I told the story of many people faced with a situation where the rational scrutiny, I quoted Antonio Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. The intellectual scrutiny tells you that everything is down, but you stand up and you fight back because you realize that this is not how you want to go down in history. I told the story about Steve Gerrard and Liverpool. I'm not going to repeat it. We don't have the time. I can tell you, I once went, I told some people in the Ghana Association of Writers many years ago, I went to watch my son in athletics. I flew from Lagos and I went to the city in which he was at the time, and he was part of a race. He was in front of the race when he slipped and he fell down. Now, he was 10 or 11, so like many young boys, he was about to give up. I don't know what possessed her. It was, I think, a 400-meter race. My wife ran from the stands and met him at the 200-meter base and screamed, "Your father has come all the way to come and watch you. You cannot give up." Something magical happened to the boy. A new burst of energy, and he just flew past the people who were ahead of him and finished the race second. He was treated as though he had won the race by the parents who were there. There are moments when the leader must stand up, and that's what I was speaking about. The leader must stand up and say, this is not how we are going to go down. And in the 18 months that we have, whatever it takes, we're going to make a difference. The question is this how Akufo-Addo wants to be remembered? If this is how he wants to be remembered, there's nothing I can do about it. If this is not, then he must stand up and fight back for his legacy, for him to be remembered, and the many other things that he did in this country to be able to get a fourth republic and so on, not be so forgotten that we will all say, had Akufo-Addo not be president, we would all have thought what a great president he would be. But today he's become president and we are not sure. That is for me. What I think, what I don't think, I mean, so it doesn't influence anything. I don't want to speculate on that. But this is the message that I'm leaving to Nana Akufo-Addo, the president.
Finally, I mean, I asked a question about our sanitation. So you've made reference to the flooding situation in Accra, that, every May, June would come back to it, have that conversation again. And it looks like a forgotten conversation in July, August, September. In 2017, we talked about how we wanted Accra to be the cleanest city in Africa by end of 2020. We extended it to end of 2024. And I'm sure you'd agree, the reality is nothing has changed. What is the problem?
Well, look, sanitation is not just a behavioral problem. When the floods happen, you hear the politicians screaming citizen behavior, and we dump things in drains, and then they get silted, and this is why. And you know the story. I don't need to tell you the story. We hear those sorts of stories. But sanitation, at the end of the day, is down to competent logistics. You have to have places where people dispose of garbage. You need to have proper city designs. You need people adhering to the law, not building in waterways and sharing land among themselves and building even in reserved areas, Achimota Forest and so on and so forth, all being encroached on. Then you have a sum total of a breakdown. Abnormal conditions, as I call them, take place, and people just litter and so on and so forth. So to be able to get a clean city, basic sanitation in place, calls for competent logistics and planning and the enforcement of law and order. When you start it and you sustain it for some time, it becomes a behavioral take-up at individual level, and then at scale, it becomes culture. And people even forget that once you have to do all these interventions. Singapore did not start out being as clean and hygienic and antiseptic as it is today. In fact, if you read Lee Kuan Yew's book, he talks about the time when stray animals were roaming the streets in an uncontrollable manner. How was the problem solved? Lee Kuan Yew gave a week, and he said that any animals that were found roaming the streets will be shot on sight. If we are serious about sanitation, I want to see 1 million people march to Jubilee House and demand it from the president and his people, and see whether it will not be done. But if we want to, everything, as Chinua Achebe said, we want civilization to fall from the sky. We don't want to break one bead of sweat. Well, then we will continue to be who we are. We have never, as a people in our nationhood, crossed $3,000 per capita as GDP, if you want to use that metric. We have never crossed it. So we need to sit back and say, since 1957, why have our collective efforts and industry not been able to yield it? $3,000 is nothing, and we have never crossed it.
Yaw Nsarkoh, Thank you very, very much for joining us this morning. I'd have loved us to continue the conversation, but that's all time would allow us, unfortunately. I'm sure we'll make time another day and have these conversations in the interest of Ghana. Thank you very much.